Today is May 30th, 2008. We'll be interviewing Mrs. Betty Yeiter, who lives at 4376 Alden Nash Avenue and was born on February 7th, 1924. All right, Mrs. Yeiter, where and when were you born?
I was born in Clarksville, Michigan, which is a suburb of Lowell, Michigan. Small town, but I was born on a farm. My parents were Swiss and came to this country when they were in their, my mom was in her teens and my dad in his 20s. And we were born on a farm near Clarksville in a boy and a girl. My daughter lives in Grand Rapids, and my son died 2.5 years ago, and he lived on the farm here and was farming.
All right. When you were growing up, where did you go to school?
I went to a country school near Clarksville. It was called the South Bell School. And then after I graduated from 8th grade, I went on to Clarksville High School. I was a member of a class of 15. In fact, I meant to tell you that I was one of the top 15 in my class because there were 15 in my class.
When you were younger, what did you do for entertainment?
Well, we did a lot of neighborhood things. We would meet with the neighbors, we'd go and play with the neighbors a lot, and then evenings, parents would get together with a number of neighbors. We'd have potlucks and things like that. And once in a while, we went to a movie, but not very often. That was a treat. Saturday nights, we usually drove into Lowell. My dad had an old Model T car, and we drove into Lowell, and he gave us 5 cents for an ice cream cone, and then we walked up and down the streets for it.
You said you lived on a farm, you grew up on a farm. What was farm life when you were younger, and what kind of chores were you expected to do on the farm?
Farm life, when I remember beginning in farm life, we had no tractors, nothing like that. It was all horses. I helped my dad with the horses. We drove that some. In fact, I remember planting corn with a 1-row planter. My dad would take 2 rows. My sister and I each would take 1, and we'd go across the field with that. We also raised onions, and my mom and my sister and I would go back to the onion patch. We'd take our lunch with us and spend all day weeding onions by hand back there.
Describe your high school and college experiences for us.
My high school experience was a lot of fun. The high school was on the top floor, and the middle school was in the first floor, and the grade school was in the basement. We were that big. We enjoyed life a lot. We were all very close. We were in awe of seniors when we were freshmen and so on, but they were there in the same room with us. And then I went on to college, to Western State Teachers College. We had a student population of 2,000. In fact, the second year that I was there, we made 2,000 population, and we were very proud of that. I enjoyed.
When did you get married and start a family?
I got married in 1947, and we were married in the Lowell Church, in the Lowell Methodist Church, and we started our family in 1951. My daughter was born in 1951, and my son was born in 1953. And by the way, when I was teaching at that time, and when we taught school at that time, and you were pregnant, you could not teach, so I had to stop teaching.
Interesting stories about the family time you spent in Lowell with your husband and your children.
We did quite a bit of, we'd go out to eat every once in a while, and we enjoyed that. Usually on Saturday nights, it was our time to go out and eat. We would go to the showboat. We went to the activities in Lowell. And again, we met with friends a lot. We had a card playing group in our neighborhood, and we would meet maybe once a week and play cards together. And I remember when the children were young, we went to the circus in Grand Rapids, and then the Lipizzan horses came to Grand Rapids, and we went to see them. And just things like that. In and around Grand Rapids. We were close enough to Grand Rapids that it wasn't that big of a deal.
So you started your teaching career before you were married, and then you had to take time off while you were married.
Yes.
When you got back into teaching, did your teaching ever get in the way of your family life?
I never thought it did. My husband even mentioned the fact that I was always home when the kids were home, and we made it a point weekends then to be home a lot. In fact, during the week we seldom went anywhere because I had papers to check and things like that, and I usually did it after the kids were in bed. So we never felt that it did. In fact, my husband said that he thought the two best occupations in the world were, he was a farmer, farming and teaching school. He thought those were God-given jobs.
All right. What prompted you to become a teacher? Like, what made you want to be a teacher?
That's all I remember that I ever wanted to do. From very young on was to be a teacher. When my sister and brother and I were young, we played school, and I was always the teacher, and they had to put up with me. I don't ever remember wanting to do anything else.
All right. So describe for us your teaching experiences, and you said you had taught in a country schoolhouse and in the Lowell schools, and what's the difference between teaching in those
There was a lot
environments?
of difference there. I felt that the 2 years in the country school that I taught were just an absolutely wonderful time. I had, I think, 15 or 17 students at that time, first through 8th grade. Kindergarten, we had kindergarten then also, kindergarten through 1st grade. And I was the band director, I was the music teacher, I was the phys ed coach, I was the play director, and I remember then one of the students whose dad was president of the school board said that after Thanksgiving we never have opened the books anymore, we start practicing for the Christmas program. So I called the board member and asked him, and he said, yes, that's what we do. And so we put on a great Christmas performance with costumes and just everything, and curtains and a stage. The school board members came and put up a stage for us, and everyone in the neighborhood came because it was wartime, and that was their outing. And so the schoolhouse was full of people that came, and we had a great time. I remember another time we had a box social at school, and used that money to, I think, for a war effort and things like that.
All right. Will you tell us about the transition and like how you got from teaching at a country school into the Lowell schools? Like, explain that transition
I liked
to us.
country school teaching, but the superintendent at the Lowell school came out to my school. I think he knew the superintendent of education that I was teaching under. He was the county superintendent. And so he came out to school one day and observed my teaching. He walked around the classroom, stayed about 5 minutes, and then he said, will you come down to Lowell and sign a contract and teach in Lowell? Well, that was sounded pretty good to me too, because it was an advancement. And so I did. I went into Lowell and started teaching 3rd grade in Lowell. Enjoyed that very much. I love 3rd graders because they love their teacher, and they knew enough to take care of themselves. So I enjoyed that. Then I went into junior high, and then I became a reading administrator, and so I went into the reading administrative part of it. And well, I have to tell you of an experience that I had. I also taught a 5th grade classroom one year because the superintendent asked me to finish up the year. That year, the students had run 5 teachers out of the classroom. And so when the superintendent asked me if I would finish the year, you never said no to your superintendent. I finished the year, but the kids were as good as they could be because I think the superintendent put a little fear into them, and that was an interesting experience also. I could name a few of them that were in my class.
Was teaching everything you expected it to be, or did it meet your expectations, or did it ever like fall short of your expectations?
I enjoyed it very much. I absolutely loved it. But as time went on, it seemed like that there were more and more stipulations set down as things as far as paperwork is concerned and so on. And I remember once putting on my door, a sign on my door, please let me teach.
Describe your biggest accomplishment during your time working in education.
I believe it was just watching these students grow and go on into high school. Some of them became really valedictorians or salutatorians. But I also noted that it isn't always just grades that were important. Some of my students that were all A students became all A dropouts or good for nothings in the community, and those, I really appreciated those that had to kind of struggle for their school, because I always had to work for my schoolwork, and so I appreciated that.
All right. During your teaching years, how did you find a balance between work at school and work at home?
Well, I think it just kind of worked together. My husband was a farmer, and we just kind of worked it out together. He helped me a lot, and I also helped him. I went down to the barn every morning. He never asked me to, but I wanted to. I went down and fed the calves at 3:45 every morning. We more or less worked together. And then when I was in the house, he would sit in the front room with me, or if I was out doing some papers, he would tell me, correcting papers, he would say, come on in the living room and do your work in here also, so that we could all sit together, which we did.
All right. So besides feeding the cows, what other chores were you expected to do on the farm during your marriage?
As I said, my husband never asked me to do anything, but I liked to do it. I liked to do things with him. I would drive tractor out in the field with him. He would drive one and I would drive one. And he usually drove the big one and gave me the little one. And one day I had to drive the big tractor. And well, first of all, I asked him once, why can't I drive the big one? And he said, well, you don't know how. But one time an emergency came up and I had to drive it, and then I said, now I can understand why he didn't let me drive it. That had air conditioning, power steering, radio, and so on, and mine didn't have any of them. But we just had a lot of fun working in the field together.
All right. What was your family's life like on the farm? In our previous interview, you talked about purchasing the land around your home and about your experiences with the dairy farming. Can you explain that to us again?
Mm-hmm. Well, my husband always believed in real estate, and he always said, we invested a little money into some investments, and that went kind of bad, and he said, I know real estate, I don't know stocks and bonds. And so when a piece of property would come up, well, first of all, we bought the property from my husband's parents, and that was okay. And then a neighbor was going to sell some, and he wanted to buy that, and I remember just having a fit because he wanted to buy it. And then we went ahead. We always discussed everything, and we went ahead and bought it, and it was very good. And then another piece would come up, and he wanted to buy that. I think when about the third piece came up, he knew it was a little bit troublesome to ask me, so guess what? He bought me a diamond ring, a second diamond in place of that, or he bought that, and then he asked me if he could buy the farm, so what could I say? I said yes.
All right, and talk about a little about the dairy farming you did and how you used to have the barns up there and why you had to take them down and such.
Yes, we went into dairy farming, and then my son went on to college. He went to Hope College, and when he came back, he wanted to farm also, which he did then, and we turned it over to him. But then as time went on, my husband wasn't able to work on the farm anymore, and my son had to work alone, and it's pretty hard to do dairy farming by yourself. You really need help, and it was hard to get help because we were so close to Grand Rapids, and they'd rather not work Saturdays and Sundays, and farming is 14 times a week. So he decided then to change from dairy farming to raising dairy replacements. And we had 3 barns. So in one barn we had the very young ones, and in another barn we had those a little older. And then in our barn here on the farm we had those that would soon be ready to sell before they were ready to milk. And all of a sudden one day the EPA came through and they said we had to close up the one barn because of runoff. And so my son told him at that time, well, someday when your grandson sits on your lap, you can tell your grandson that you helped close down some of the farms. And then a few years later, they came through and they said we had to close up a second barn because of runoff into a development. Well, with one barn, you couldn't do that anymore. So we decided to go out of the business, and then my son, we rented out the land to others that were going into it in a bigger way. And then my son went to work with a company and was sort of a go fetch it man for them, went from one job to the other and things like that.
All right. When you weren't farming, what did you and your husband do together, like your travels and stuff?
We traveled a lot. I think we traveled every state in the United States except Alaska and Hawaii. And one time we took the train around the United States, which was an interesting experience. And we went out east a lot because we were very interested in history, and my husband's family was related to Dr. Joseph Warren, who was a good friend of the rebel Samuel Adams, and he was killed on Bunker Hill, and we'd go there. We went to Boston, and we enjoyed history together. And then after the children were older, we traveled to Europe a lot, and we traveled to Europe because my husband was in World War II in the Battle of the Bulge, and we wanted to go over there and walk the grounds that he had walked, and we went with his army buddies and a few times, and then we would go on from there. We went into Czechoslovakia because that's where they stopped after World War II, and then my husband and I went to other countries as well. Our biggest and probably most enjoyable time was in Egypt. We went to Egypt twice. We went through the pyramids, and we went up and down the Nile as far as Sudan, and enjoyed that immensely.
All right. Is there anyone, like, what was your favorite thing that you saw during your travels and people that you met?
My favorite in my traveling was historical places. I guess the reason we liked Egypt, I remember at that time Jackie Kennedy was concerned about some of the artifacts in Egypt because they were building the Aswan Dam. Those had to be moved, and that made quite an impression on me, so we went there because of that. And I loved British history because I was a young teenager when World War II started, and it made quite an impression on me. And I heard Winston Churchill make his famous speeches, so I wanted to go to number 10 Downing Street and London, and I read a lot about Mary Queen of Scots, and so I wanted to go to Edinburgh. And in fact, my husband was there also during the war, and so we went to these places. And my husband loved cathedrals, so we went through many, many cathedrals and that type of thing.
All right. Start becoming involved in the Lowell community outside of teaching?
More or less after I retired from teaching in 1984. I had more time. I became very active with Women's Club. And in Women's Club, I was usually the top banana as far as selling things was concerned. And selling entertainment books or selling nuts and things like that. And this money went towards anything in Lowell, usually for scholarships and anything that would help people in Lowell. I know one year we gave $200 to a lady or a young girl that needed a special kind of wheelchair in high school. And so being top banana, the first year I got 3 bananas, and I thought, well, that's great. And then the next year I was top banana. I thought, well, they'd give me 4. Well, they gave me 5 that year. And then the third year I was top banana. I thought, well, they'll give me 7 this year. No, they cut me back to 3. And I also worked at the Ford Museum, and I did some work with the art museum for a while and things like that.
All right, now can you tell us about your awards that you have here, your awards and your plaque?
Well, my best award is this one. When I retired from teaching, the junior high teachers put this together for me. And I absolutely love that because it's exactly what I feel. If you can read, you can do anything. So I'm very pleased with that. And this one is, last year I was the Person of the Year award from Lowell, and don't ask me why I got it. I have no idea why I got it. I remember I was at church, and they usually made the announcement somewhere in a public place, and when they were giving the announcements in the church, you listen, but you don't listen. And then all of a sudden I heard my name, and I thought, well, what did I do now? And this was what I did. I got that. And I thought you might be interested in this also. My husband found these arrowheads and a number of others. These are the most valuable ones on our farm, right next to the barn where the cows were, where the grass was not growing. And he found all of these, and so they're very precious to me also.
All right. And what about the pictures you have here? Can you tell us about those and the experiences?
I went to, when I was 75 years old, I went to Habitat for Humanity to the Philippines. And we built houses. We had to build them in a little village because most Filipinos didn't have cars. They had public transportation. And this is the type of home that we would build. Instead of 2x4s, they would be 2x2s. And I helped carry those. We built the home with blocks. And this is the type of house that we built. These are kind of out of order, but we built them in little rows, and former President Carter was in building a house right next to where I was building, and every house was sponsored by someone. I noticed where the Rotary Club of the United States had sponsored one, and also the Women's Club of the world had sponsored one also. And this is Jimmy Carter when he was working. He worked just like we did, got dirty and tired. We usually ate breakfast together, all of us, and then went out to work. 5 o'clock in the morning we had to go for breakfast, and then went to work, and then left about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We all left dirty and tired, and we'd go to bed afterwards. And this is Rosalind Carter working away there. And this is what the houses looked like when they were finished. And this would, to get into this house, you would have trouble getting your car in it. And this house was to be big enough for a husband and wife and 4 to 6 children. Their bathroom was about 3 by 3. It just had a toilet in it. Their kitchen was very small, and they had, it was divided into 1 bedroom, and they probably slept on mats, a lot of them, but they were very small. But the people that got them were absolutely thrilled to get them, because we saw where they lived before. They lived just off on the side of the road and put reeds up against a tree and lived behind that. We didn't have to build them a closet because they didn't have many clothes. They probably had the shirt that they had on, and then they got a Jimmy Carter.
I'm trying to think the best way to read this. Is there anything you feel should change about Lowell and the community of Lowell?
No, I believe in, you can't stop change. I believe in that because times change, our population is getting larger, and that's all right. I guess as far as education is concerned, and has been sort of a movement in that direction, smaller schools than the great big schools that we have. And I know a few years back they started what they called was a freshman center, and I thought that was a pretty good idea when the people would more or less stick together instead of being one of 4 grades and so on. No, I can't think of anything. I think Lowell does all they can do. We can be very proud of our Lowell Chamber of Commerce. They work very hard to keep Lowell as old-fashioned and as modern as it can be. Mm-hmm.
What have you contributed to the community? Like, what do you think you've done that's benefited the community?
Well, for a number of years, the Kent County Parks has been after our land because of the lay of the land. It's hilly and so on, and wanted this land for county parks. And having studied the Constitution, in the Constitution is the right of eminent domain. Government things can, with the right of eminent domain, they can make you sell to them. And my son had been meeting with the park people occasionally, and he never let them meet with me because he knew I wasn't too interested in that. But after my son passed away, I thought, well, that is a pretty good idea because I'd like to keep this area as rural as possible. When my husband lost his left arm when he was 48 years old, someone stopped and asked me if they could buy some of my land and build some condominiums on it. And he was in the hospital, so I went to the hospital and told him that. And he said, "What did you say?" And I said, "No." And I could see his shoulders go back, and he felt so proud that I wouldn't do anything like that. So last year, I sold the land on the east side of the road to the county parks. And so this will be a county park, it'll be an equestrian trail, and other areas for people to use. Then on the west side of the road, I'm a firm believer in education, and when they built the new school, the high school out on Virgins and north of Lowell, before they built it, my husband said that is not where that school should have been. That school should have been right out here on our property because it was near the freeway. And I remembered that, and so I am donating or giving some land to the high school or to the Lowell Education or Lowell Public Schools in order to do something. The only stipulation I'll make is that it will be used for educational purposes, and I've given them 25 acres of land for that.
All right. As we wrap this up, what would you like to see happen for the community of Lowell in the future? Anything?
Well, I really can't think of anything special, and I guess I just like what I see in Lowell. My husband always said, we live in Lowell, we will shop in Lowell. I like the small town. I think people care more in a small town than they do in your bigger cities. However, I'm glad I live close to a big city so that I can partake in the arts that they provide for you, as well as I'm very pleased with Lowell and their drama work that they do in high school and so on. I don't know how they do it all. It's marvelous. I think the productions that they give are absolutely great.
Is there anything like you would like to say that you've forgotten to mention or that we forgot to ask you about?
Yes, I would like to tell you about the way I taught my subjects. I had a real interest in, I taught, I don't call it social studies, but I call it geography, history, and civics. I was very interested in government, so when I taught government, we taught the Constitution word for word. And my superintendent always said you had to memorize some things. He'd come in and ask me if I had give any memory work to the students, and I always did, like the preamble and different things. Part of the Constitution, we learned that also. But my reason for teaching the way I did was because I like to travel, and I taught it from the standpoint of traveling. If you went to Hungary or Austria, what did you see there, and why, and how does that control what the people do? Because what the people do is certainly controlled by geography as well as by history. And so I taught it from that standpoint. And as I said, we did memory work also. And then I tried to tell them if they go and visit, these are probably some of the things that you would see, especially in relation to history. And then I also forgot to tell you that, what was it I was going to tell you?
How expectations of teaching.
Oh yes, and the expectations of teaching has changed tremendously when I started in 1944. The superintendent back then could tell you what to do, and you had to do it. Another thing back then, you were to be a person that your students could look up to. We were not to go to the bars and things like that. And I remember one time my husband, or he was my boyfriend at the time, went to a bar which was outside of Lowell. The next Monday morning, my superintendent called me into his office and he said, you know, your boyfriend was seen in the bar last weekend. And so I mentioned that to my husband, and he said he would never go there again, and he didn't. But back then, your superintendent could tell you exactly what to do. And as I said, he would come in and tell you what to teach and so on. And also, as far as grading is concerned, we did at that time what they called a bell curve. If you gave 2 E's, you had to give 2 A's, and so on. And he would look in your book to see now, if you gave 2 E's, 2 A's, did you give 2 E's also? And you gave the majority of C's. So your teaching was kind of controlled by that. But I didn't like that very well because I really hated to give an E if a student was doing all they could do. And back then, we could refuse to pass a student if we felt that they should be retained and take another year. I remember a parent coming to me and asking that their son be retained because they felt that he didn't learn as much as he should have. And I did retain him, and he accepted it real well, maybe because his parents wanted it. But he went on and went into the insurance business and has done very well. And as I told you, some of my A students became first-class bums also, so that doesn't always tell. And this bothers me today, that too much emphasis is put on grades. I have a 4 or I have a 3.9. To me, there are other things that are so much more important. Your participation in the arts and things like that. And who you are as an individual. Because sometimes if a student learns easily, that doesn't mean that they will be a good citizen. And I've always been very much against that. Another thing that I always appreciated was a European school system. They tested their students early as to whether they would be great in academics and go to a regular school or go to technical schools. Now, I kind of believe in that. I just wish we did something more of that, because I think students today are harassed by their peers and by their parents. You've got to go to college. You have to go to not a technical school, but you have to go to college because everyone else does. And to me, this is wrong. I remember one student that I had was a very poor student as far as books is concerned, but 5 or 6 years later, he got a job and was making a lot more money, and when he graduated from high school was making a lot more money than I did as a teacher, because he was very good with his hands and things like that. So academics aren't always the true sign of an individual.
Okay.
So those are some changes I would like to see.
Thank you very much for your time.
You're entirely welcome.